Hey guys, it's Lily. Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. In case you didn't know this, I'm located in St. Pete, Florida, which is on the west coast, like near Tampa. And right now we are going through a hurricane. There's a hurricane. Hurricane Nicole is hitting the east coast of Florida as a Category 1, and then by the time it made it to us earlier this morning, it was already a tropical storm, so we should be fine. We're just getting some wind, rain. It hasn't really stopped raining since I woke up this morning. But here I am shooting a YouTube video because I'm bored. And so I'm just going to show you how to make moss poles and just try to stay productive during a hurricane. So I'm going to teach you how to make two different types of moss poles. I use this specific one. Okay, hold on, first of all. This is my Philodendron Pedatum. It's a variegated pedatum, and I started this plant about a year and a half ago, and when I first got it, actually I still have the original leaf. It's like down here, and it's this tiny leaf in the bottom. I hope you can see that. But yeah, I started with this one leaf cutting of this variegated pedatum. There. It's beautiful. I got a cutting from a local plant friend, and I've been growing it for like a year and a half. It has been on a moss pole since I got it, or like shortly after I gave it a moss pole. It's a climbing type of philodendron, and what that means is that normally in nature, this plant would be climbing up like a hill, or not a hill, a cliff, or some sort of tree. It usually grabs onto trees, and it grows all the way to the top, and then it gets like huge leaves as it reaches the top of the canopy. And so as you can tell, it started out with the really tiny, just beautiful leaves, and then as it got bigger and older, it started developing the actual adult mature leaf shape that pedatums are known for. And so now, because it has gotten, actually in the last couple months, I've gotten these big leaves right here. The top three leaves are all like, they have not stopped growing. So I know now that it's gotten bigger, the plant is just gonna grow at a faster rate, and I don't want to run out of moss pole in the next couple of months, because I think it'll grow up to here in the next couple of months. So with that being said, I need to make a moss pole for this one, because I want to make sure it has something to grab onto as it gets older. The whole point of making a moss pole for a climbing philodendron is the fact that it has a tendency, climbing philodendrons have a tendency to grow aerial roots at almost every node, especially if there's moisture around where that node is. So I don't know, hopefully it can focus there, but you can see a root there. And you can actually see some roots on the back of the moss pole. Right here, there's one that's reached all the way to the back, and then here. So the whole point is plants usually grow their roots at the very bottom, at the very base of the plant, but climbing philodendrons, because in nature they normally climb up trees, grow aerial roots that attach to the tree, and then when it rains, the roots that are on the tree absorb moisture from the environment and from the tree. So what we're trying to do with putting it on a moss pole is kind of trying to replicate the way it grows in nature. And so essentially every single node, theoretically, if you maintain the moisture on the moss pole, should remain pretty moist, and every single node should grow aerial roots that go into the moss and grow through the moss. So what you want to do when you put a plant on a moss pole is you want to make sure that when you water the plant, first of all, it has to have very good drainage, because if you put a plant on a moss pole, you're going to end up finding out that if the soil you put it in isn't coarse enough and doesn't aerate the roots enough, you're going to end up rotting the plant, because there's moisture on the moss pole, and the moisture comes down to the bottom where your potting mixture is. So when you water a plant that's on a moss pole, you always have to water the actual moss. The whole point of putting a plant on a moss pole is not just to give it support, because if you're just trying to give it support, then you could just use one of these stakes and call it a day. The whole point of putting it on a moss pole is to maintain that humidity, so the plant is going to start growing aerial roots that will then root onto the moss. And then theoretically, every single node is air rooted for you. So if you ever needed to cut the plant later on, that node is already rooted, so you wouldn't lose that node. So the whole point of having a moss pole is maintaining the moisture and the humidity, the moisture on the moss, so the plant will be persuaded, I guess, to grow roots onto the moss pole. So if you don't keep your moss pole moist, or at least attempt to keep it moist, then you're kind of just defeating the purpose of going through the trouble of making one. But this type of moss pole I prefer to use inside because the backing of it is plastic. So it doesn't allow the water to evaporate as much as a regular moss pole does, because only the front of it is allowing the water to evaporate. It's also easier to water because you don't have to water the back of it, you just water the front of it. And that's it. No water is going to come out of the bottom. I just find that it stays moist longer inside the house than the regular moss pole does. So this is my preferred moss pole for my indoor plants. And then this one, it's so pretty. This one is my preferred moss pole for my outdoor plants. This is one of the first ones I ever made. So this plant is actually inside, it's in my office, but because it was one of the first moss poles I made, it was before I experimented with the second type. So we're going to be making one of these. We're going to make a moss pole extension for this one. I don't know if you can tell, but it already outgrew the moss pole, and as you can see, the leaves have gotten bigger and bigger as it goes up the moss pole. And there's various nodes that I can see roots have attached or grabbed onto that moss and have actually rooted onto the moss. Just this one is a little bit more of a pain to water if it's inside. Because if you allow the moss to dry out all the way, then it will be harder for it to absorb moisture the next time that you go to water your moss pole. So this one is going to be, there's no plastic backing to this one, and this is the one that I normally use outside, and this one has plastic in the back, and this is the one that I prefer to use inside. You'll notice that both of them have a stake in them, and that's because you need to just give it support so that the plant doesn't tip over. So yeah, that's what we'll be doing today. Alright, so now we gotta make an extension pole for my Sygnonium Chiapense. It obviously has gotten huge. I've been doing a terrible job of watering this moss pole, so it's hydrophobic right now. And that just means that it dried out too much, and so it's having a hard time, it's gonna have a hard time absorbing water the next time I water it. So I'm gonna have to thoroughly shower the moss to be able to allow it to absorb water. But right now I'm just gonna make an extension, and it's gonna be a pole that is gonna be tied to the top of where the moss pole currently ends. So it has to be the same type of pole. It's just a traditional moss pole. So I'm gonna show you. Stay. Okay, so I'm gonna show you what the supplies that we'll need to be able to make this moss pole. So first we start out with a bag of moss. I get this bad boy at Home Depot, but you can get it on Amazon. You can get a similar moss at pretty much any garden center. It's just sphagnum moss. Yeah, you want to use good moss. So this is the one I use. We're gonna need wire cutters. I got this type, but honestly I wish I had gotten one that was narrower on the top or on the tip. Then we're gonna have a hole puncher. Actually, no, we don't need a hole puncher because a hole puncher is for the other type. So we need zip ties. I use 4-inch zip ties because we don't need them to be long. We're gonna need metal stakes. I don't use the bamboo stakes for my moss poles because the bamboo ends up giving out after a few months. It doesn't like to remain moist for that long. So I go with the metal ones. And then hardware cloth. It's hardware cloth that is coated in green vinyl. It's 1/2 inch wide, so the spacing is 1/2 inch. And it is 19 gauge wire, whatever that means. But yeah, I got this at Home Depot. You can get similar ones at your local hardware store. I just like the one that's covered in vinyl so it doesn't rust. And it just looks nicer because it's green and it matches the stake. All right, so we'll start off by opening this bad boy, which is gonna take a while. All right, so I opened my wire, and what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna try to lay it on the ground and try to flatten it as much as possible, just because it would be really annoying to try to cut this on top of the table before you flatten it. So I'm gonna try to open a little bit of it and just flatten it on the ground. So the first thing we gotta do is we gotta get the moss wet. And so I have 2 bowls. I have an empty bowl, and then I have a bowl that is almost full of water. So I'm just gonna take the moss and dip it in there. You wanna make sure that the moss, you start off with wet moss, because it's gonna be extra hard to like decide how much moss needs to go on the pole if it's dry, because the moss kind of expands when you get it wet. Also, unless you want to shower the plant immediately after you attach the moss pole, then it's just easier to start off with moist moss rather than hydrophobic moss. Like that won't want to absorb water. So I just dipped all the moss in there to get it nice and wet. And then I'm just going to wring out as much of the water as I can. And then if there's any like this stuff, like stuff that isn't moss that is big and you can just take out with your hands, go ahead and do so, because that's just gonna mess with the roots later. So I'm just gonna open it up, like fluff up the moss in the other bowl, and I'm gonna continue to do that until, there it is, until I do all of the moss. So I don't need that right now. So I'm just gonna make sure that the moss is nice and fluffy. And that's good. All right, so now that the moss is moist and is in the bowl on the side, I went ahead and I cut 32 inches worth of the hardware wire. And I cut it to be 32 inches because that is the height that I need it to be so it doesn't touch the ceiling in the office. So go ahead and measure whatever it is you need to measure to make sure that it'll fit in your space before you start going down this rabbit hole. So if I was just making a regular moss pole that I wasn't using as an extension for another plant that already has a moss pole, then I would usually just make it about 18 squares, which is, yeah, about 9 inches. And so I would cut the wire to be about 9 inches wide. But because I'm trying to match the size of this, I'm literally gonna sit here and count how many squares are in here. 13. Okay. 13, 14, 15. All right, so now I determined that there were 15 squares in this moss pole. So this moss pole is somehow 15 squares wide. So now, let me put this back. And I'm going to cut 15 squares off of here. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. So I'm going to cut 15 wide. So now that I have my wire cut, this is the exact measurement that I made that one in. All I need to do is kind of bend it a little bit. I try to bend it into shape before I put any moss in there. Because it's going to be harder to do it after, and plus it also helps you figure out how much moss needs to go in there. The first mistake I ever made when I started making my own moss poles is that I overstuffed it with moss and it was just way too heavy and not airy at all. So don't make the same mistake I did when I made my first one. You don't want to overstuff it with moss. You want to put enough moss in there to where it'll keep that moisture and there's enough for the roots to attach to, but I mean, you don't want to drown out the roots by like having it too tight in there. So same concept as your potting mix. Your potting mix needs to be airy, so does your moss. So I did my best to kind of shape it into a circle. Not a circle, a cylinder. And now I kind of know how wide it's going to be. So I'm going to grab my moss and I'm going to see it's fluffy, moist. So I'm going to grab a small handful and I'm going to start at the top. So because this is an extension to one that I already have, I'm going to leave a small gap in the bottom without moss so that I can overlap the wire on top of the other one. I'm going to try to. But I'm not great at this, so we'll see. So I'm just gonna do this all along the moss pole, and then once I'm done, I'm gonna try to close it and just see if I put enough moss in there or if I put too much, if I put too little. There, and as you are putting the moss in there, take out any of those non-moss fibers that you find in there. There's usually like little sticks. See? Like you don't need that in there. Alright, just one more. Alright, so try to make sure that it's evenly distributed. Like just now I had way more here than I did here. So I'm just like evening it out with the tip of my fingers. But I mean, it doesn't have to be like the perfect moss pole. It just has to be structurally sound, I guess. So now that I've done that, you see, it's a pain. All right, maybe a little bit more moss. And maybe I shouldn't throw out the moss I already have in there. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I gotta put the stake in there, and I want to have 0 extra stake length on the top end of it because it's an extension. I want the extra stake to go on the side that is going to connect with the other moss pole. So I'm just going to make space for the stake in here, like there you go. Just moving the moss a little bit so that the stake goes a little in the middle. All right, that should be good. This is the hardest part now. It's bending the wire into shape. I usually end up like, I mean, my hands already look terrible. So if you want to wear gloves, by all means wear gloves. I am terrible with gloves on, so I'm just going to do it this way and suffer the consequences later. So I'm just going to take a bunch of the zip ties. All right, I'm not using these white ones. I'm using the black ties. All right, so I'm going to take a bunch of these zip ties, and usually I do the middle one first, so I get a feel for how it should be. And I'm only overlapping one square. So I don't know if I can show you this. Let me tie it first, then I'll show you. Ha! All right, I got it in there. I got the first one. The first one is always the hardest unless you have a helper. If you have a helper, then this would be so much easier. But okay, so the first one is secured. And I did, if you can tell, I don't know if you can tell, but I just overlapped one square over the other. And now I'm gonna do both ends, and then I'll fill it in. And I'm gonna try to make it the same length, or the same width. Flatten it if you need to. It'll make your life easier, because you can always just reshape it into a cylinder after it's been tied. Okay, hardest part is done. So now we're just gonna go and put in a zippy tie. Because I use small little 4-inch ties that aren't super wide, I go like every 4 squares, I will put in, so about every 2 inches, since you know each square is half an inch, so about every 2 inches I will put in a zippy tie and just tighten it as much as possible. I finished. Okay, so the next step is going to be just to cut all this extra zip tie off. Alright, so now that I've done that, if you notice it's like super flat because I had such a hard time getting in the first 3 zippy ties. So now I'm just going to put it this way on the table and I'm going to press down on it. And that'll kind of flatten it out into a cylinder shape again. And a little on this side without hurting yourself. Alright. It's pretty good. Now, if you notice, like right here, there's like a space with literally 0 moss. I'm gonna try to stuff some in there. And here. Alright, there's another gap here. Now, you don't have to be a perfectionist, that's just me. Alright, so now we have a moss pole. Ta-da! So this is going to be the hard part, is going to be trying to attach this big moss pole on top of the other one. As you can see, I left a little bit of the stake on top of this one. And what I'm going to try to do, just extra hard on camera, is attach this one to the top. Okay, so that's not gonna work. I'm gonna have to put extra moss here because this one's not wide enough to overlap. But that's okay. Alright, so I'm going to, there we go. In hindsight, I could have made it an inch wider, but if I did that, it'd probably be too heavy, and it would have just toppled over anyways, so we'll just figure it out. It's fine. Here we go. All right, so now that is filled. And we have all the extra steak on this side and a little extra over here. So this steak is going to go into this one, and this one is going to go into here. All right, and I'm having the zippy ties line up just for aesthetic purposes. And now I'm going to grab extra zippy ties and tie the two together. All right, so I used about 5 zippy ties to tie it all the way around, and now I'm just gonna cut the extra zippy tie. All right. But because this plant is going to be so top heavy, I'm going to take an extra big steak and I'm going to put it, let's see, I think I want to do back here. So I'm going to put it all the way at the end of the pot, and I'm going to take a zippy tie. There we go. There. Now it's tied to the top of the moss pole, and I'm going to tie it to the middle and then the bottom as well. Alright, that moss pole was a nightmare. I really hate making those. It's terrible on my hands. It's a pain in the butt to attach to the other moss pole. It ends up being extra heavy. I mean, like, just an obnoxious amount of weight for a tall plant. So a lot of the times when you make a moss pole like that, that is really tall, you end up having to repot the plant into something bigger to be able to have enough weight in the bottom, or you end up having to put the pot in a bigger pot, or you end up having to use like 3 different stakes just to hold it up enough. And then the other challenge that you'll end up encountering, especially if you have this indoors, is how are you supposed to water the top of that moss pole and keep it moist enough inside the house without having to grab it and put it in the shower every day just to like get the entire thing wet. So anyways, that's why I don't like using those inside. Outside it's fine because I could just take the hose and water the crap out of that moss pole until it's like completely soaked, and it'll stay at least a little moist for the next like 4 or 5 days. But inside it's a pain, and I don't ever want to have to do that again. So as soon as it's time for me to repot those plants that have the old type of moss pole I used to make, I will end up switching them to something else. So this type of moss pole that I'm going to show you how to make now. So for this one, you need the same zippy ties, same wire cutter. You'll need a hole puncher, a single hole puncher. You'll need scissors, a ruler. You will need a marker. I use an Expo marker so I can just take it off. And then you'll need some sort of plastic. So this is from the Dollar Tree. It's a chopping mat. but it's honestly very, very thin. Like I wouldn't chop a single vegetable on here. But it's honestly perfect for our purpose. So you could use like, I don't know, dividers. I don't know. Go to your local Dollar Tree and see what you find. But this is the material we're working with. It's very flimsy, almost pretty see-through plastic. It's bendy and it's pretty thin. So one of the two surfaces is shiny and the other one is matte. I do the shiny part inside and then matte outside. So since I'm making an extension for this pole, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my measuring tape and I'm going to measure how wide this one was. So this one was 3.5 inches wide. So I'm going to grab my ruler, my expo marker, and I'm going to measure 3.5 inches twice. So here's 3.5 inches, and then here's 7 inches. I'm going to do that again. So 3.5 and 7. Perfect. Okay. So now that I've measured that, I'm going to go ahead and cut it. Alright, so they should be the same width. And they are. So the next thing I'm going to do, I think I mentioned this, but I like to put the shiny part inside because as you can tell, like everything, like the kinetic energy is crazy and it just grabs onto everything as it is already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line them up one on top of the other like this, and I'm going to decide how tall I want to make it. So yeah, that's good. So I'm going to leave, let's see how tall this is. That's about 3 inches of overlapping between the two of them. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my hole puncher and I'm going to punch 3 holes. Make sure I line it up properly. Okay, good. So the other thing that I want to make sure you do is when you put the moss pole on here, always make sure that the bottom piece is on top of the top piece. Like see here, this one is on top of this one, because in case there's any excess water, the excess water won't roll out of it. So then I'm going to grab my zippy ties and I'm just going to zippy tie it there. Just for now, so it stays in place. And then I'm just going to make a bunch of holes up and down. And I'm going to make them about 1 inch apart. You could do 2 inches, however long you want your spaces to be. But I do about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. All right, perfect. So I did 3 overlapping holes in the middle, and then I just did a bunch of holes on both sides. So I measured out my wire and I cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 squares. And that's just because that's how many I used on this one, so I wanted it to be the same size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up, and there's going to be extra wire, and that's just because I had already cut this one for the other moss pole that I'm making. So I'm just going to cut that extra wire off. Perfect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the wire to one side of the plastic. Only one side, not both sides. Alright, so now that I put an obnoxious number of zippy ties on the wire, I'm just going to go ahead and cut the extra plastic off. That's out of the way. So now all we have is this, right? That doesn't look like a moss pole. So the next step is to kind of shape the wire to look a little bit like a moss pole. So you just want to bend it a little bit with your hands. So there, see? Maybe a little more. It just depends on how wide you want it to be. So now that I've done that, see there's that space there. What I'm gonna do is lay the moss pole flat on the wire, and I'm gonna take my moss and just kind of spread it there. On top of the wire, not on top of the plastic. And you don't want to make it too thick because it's going to be just way too heavy if you make it too thick, and then it's just going to end up toppling over. All right, make sure it's even. And you don't want your moss to be too wet. You want it to be moist, but you don't want it to be like dripping with water. So now I'm gonna take my handy dandy stake and I'm gonna put it, so you wanna make sure when you put the stake down that you're thinking of how this is gonna sit on top of the moss pole. So remember I told you that one side should go over, so the bottom side should go over the top. So that means that this side right here will be the top of our moss pole. So you want to have the end of the stake line up with the top of the moss pole, and then I'm going to push it down some, put a little bit extra moss where I feel like it's lacking. Okay, I have like no more moss. So I'm just gonna take all this extra stuff. All right, yeah, this looks good. And so, let me see if I can show you. See, in the middle, lay it flat on top of the moss. And then you're just gonna put this right over it. And now you're gonna take your zippy tie, see? And you're gonna attach it to the other side. There. I usually do the middle and then the two ends first, then the others will just end up being easier after. Okay, so now I zippy tied every single hole, and now I'm just gonna go through and cut the excess plastic off. Alright, and that's it. We're done. So you can see the stake in the back. One of my favorite parts about using this plastic is that you'll be able to see the roots on the back as the plant grows aerial roots into the moss. But I mean, you can use a black plastic or a different color plastic if that's all you can find. I just really like this one because it's see-through, so you can actually see, like right here, you can see that that node is rooted into the moss. So if you needed to cut the plant, you know that node there is rooted. So now I'm going to, there we go, put this stake in here and this one here. And I'm gonna try my best to not destroy this and just push it down. Alright, so this is not a perfect science. As you can see, when I pushed it, a lot of the moss went to the top, but I can fix that later. So now I'm gonna grab more zippy ties, and I'm going to attach wire to wire and plastic to plastic. So I forgot to do something. One thing you want to do is you want to do a hole here and one here, so you can attach one plastic to the other. And that is why you want to have a single hole puncher, so you can just get in there pretty easily. All right, let's try to do this without destroying. This is going to be hard. Usually I have longer nails and I can there we go. Get creative, figure it out. So now that I've attached the plastic to plastic, now I'm just going to grab a few zippy ties and attach the wires together. Just easier said than done. And I'm just using my fingernail to dig it out. So if you don't have fingernails, I don't know how you're gonna do it. Got a buddy to help you? I don't know. And that's it. See, this is so much easier than that big giant moss pole I made earlier. It's less heavy because you're using less moss. You're using less wire because the back of it is plastic. Plastic doesn't weigh that much, and it maintains the moisture longer than the other types of pole. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the gaps that I just destroyed with extra moss, and then I'll show you the end result. But here we have it. Ta-da! Alright, so if you do what I did and you end up making a hole in the moss, a gap in the moss as you put it, as you attach it to each other, what I end up doing is taking a chopstick and just using my fingertips to push in a little bit of the moss in through the little squares to fill in that gap. And just kind of do the best you can. I mean, it's not an exact science. But that's it. Your hands are not going to look pretty after this. I guarantee it. So maybe schedule a manicure after. Alright, so I finished my moss poles. As you can tell, this one is definitely my favorite. It's a lot easier to maintain, it's a lot easier to make. Your hands will thank you for not making the other type, but whatever, it's up to you which one you decide to make. I've now shown you both, so feel free to try both of them out and let me know how they do for you. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you tune back in next week. Not really sure what I'm going to cover next week. But hopefully it'll be something fun and useful that you guys can apply to your own collection. So thank you for tuning in, and make sure you subscribe and comment below with your thoughts, and let me know if you have any ideas of what I should cover next. Thank you. Bye.